And can everyone hear me? Let's see, okay. Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the brief delay, a little bit of technology, and then this was a very, very popular webinar, and many folks have signed up. So welcome once again. I am Dr. Dean Kotlowski, Professor of History at Salisbury University. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, a number of individuals and offices at Salisbury University provided support and assistance in making this event possible. I wish to thank them, starting with my colleagues on the Black History Month, which is chaired by my colleague, Dr. Aston Gonzalez of SU's History Department. Funding came for tonight's event from the Fulton School of Liberal Arts and Dean Martin Perrin, the College of Health and Human Services, and Dean Kelly Fiala, and the History Department and its chairperson, Dr. Emily Story. Technical and administrative support came from Robin Hoffman and Melissa Hampton, for whose efforts we are not only most grateful, but I would say eternally grateful at this point. Events marking Black History Month continue through the first week of March. So please look for notices in Panorama, on the Salisbury University website, and through email reminders. Tomorrow, Friday, February 4th, from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. is the second annual Anti-Racism Summit via Zoom. And on Tuesday, February 8th at 7 p.m., there will be a discussion by Dr. Keisha Blaine of her book, Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America. And it's a wonderful read, as is Dr. Jones's book that we'll be discussing tonight. The event with Dr. Blaine will be in person as well as via Zoom. Again, please look for notices on these and subsequent events. As we move forward with our program, we are doing so with a strong feeling of solidarity and solemnity for HBCUs that in recent days have faced threats of violence and bombings. Our thoughts are with you. Learning should always be safe, welcoming, and inclusive. And I realize that this is going to be rebroadcast, so bear in mind this is very time sensitive, and I'm speaking to you on February 4th, February 3rd, 2022. The career of tonight's speaker, Dr. James H. Jones, embodies learning and inclusiveness in a variety of venues and topic areas. I first became acquainted with the scholarship and professional contributions of Dr. Jones in 1995 when he delivered a keynote address at a conference celebrating the centennial of the History Department at Indiana University, where Dr. Jones earned his PhD in history in 1972. Conference organizers at that point pointed out that the IU's History Department, home to many distinguished historians, also had produced excellent teacher scholars, with James Jones being a leading example. Dr. Jones has been a high school history teacher, a program officer and specialist at the National Endowment for the Humanities, and a distinguished professor of history at two major research universities, the University of Houston and the University of Arkansas. His most recent book, Alfred C. Kinsey, A Public-Private Life, enlarged understanding of the life, work, and world of the path-breaking sexologist, Alfred Kinsey. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Dr. Jones has discussed the Kinsey biography on NBC's Today Show, the CBS Morning News, and NPR, as well as on documentaries about Kinsey for the BBC, A&E, and PBS's American Experience. Dr. Jones's first book, and the one which is the topic of tonight's talk, has also been a magnet for awards, accolades, and news media, and even popular cultural attention. Bad Blood, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, has been featured on Good Morning America and NPR's All Things Considered, and it served as the basis of documentaries by PBS's Nova program and the BBC. It inspired David Felshu's play, Miss Evers' Boys, and was made into an HBO movie of the same name, starring Alfre Woodard. First published 41 years ago, Bad Blood is a classic work of African-American history and of the nexus between racism, government policy, and healthcare. It is relevant to American society today, and of course to Black History Month's 2022 theme, Black Health and Wellness. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. James H. Jones. And I will mute myself, turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. I should comment at the beginning that I'm having a touch of laryngitis, so my voice won't be as strong as as I would like for it to be. But we're going to sip some water and we'd like to get through this. I became interested in the Tuskegee study immediately after I finished my doctorate at Indiana University in the summer of 1972. I was fortunate to get a postdoctoral fellowship to Harvard in a new program, the Interfaculty Program in Bioethics and the History of Medicine. And I went there really to continue work on my dissertation. But en route, Gene Heller of the Associated Press, when I say en route, literally, as I was driving from Bloomington to Boston, Gene Heller broke the Tuskegee story in 4 very hard-hitting articles that shocked the country about an untreated syphilis program in Macon County, Alabama, conducted by the United States Public Health Service. So when I got to Cambridge, I made a decision then not to work on Kinsey any further, but to work on Tuskegee. And the reason I made that decision was that 2 years earlier, when I was in the National Archives working on on Kinsey, I came across material on the Tuskegee study in Record Group 90, the Public Health Service records of the Division of Venereal Diseases. When I saw that material, I had no idea that the experiment was still going on. I was, after all, in an archive, but I remembered that material, and when I got to Cambridge and saw Gene Heller's articles, I decided to go to work on Tuskegee. It took some doing to get access to the materials themselves, because the Justice Department under Nixon, under Richard Milhouse Nixon, ordered the National Archives to sequester all materials, saying that they were going to do their own investigation. I didn't trust the Justice Department. I was afraid those materials would be deep-sixed. So I called a friend, Albert Leisinger, who was the deputy archivist in the United States, and asked him if he could get me into the material before they were surrendered to the Justice Department. As it turns out, they were having difficulty finding the materials because they had been moved from the National Archives to Suitland, Maryland, to the Federal Record Center. And in the process, I guess they had gotten misshelved. So he said that because they hadn't been able to find him, I could go ahead and come and look. I did. It took a few days, but I found them. And that was the beginning of my research. When I went to work on Tuskegee, I thought I had all the answers before I started. I thought it would be a simple morality play. I thought I would study doctors with sort of blood dripping from their fangs, and that they were out to do evil, and that all I had to do was just uncover the many ways in which they did evil. Well, certainly they did evil, but as so often true with life, if you scratch beneath the surface, the story is more complicated. In Bat Blood, I try to place the Tuskegee study in a broad historical context. I want to begin really with African Americans after the Civil War. After the Civil War, very little changes for most African Americans. The system of chattel property is replaced by peonage, the sharecrop system, the crop lien system. The economic stagnation of those work systems is exacerbated by a deepening of racism in society that is associated with the rise of Jim Crow laws. So the late 19th century, spilling over into the 20th century, is really the nadir of race relations. In addition to the loss of vote, in addition to the loss of franchise, the African Americans suffer from some of the poorest health of any group in our society. They eat a 3M diet. They suffer from pellagra, they suffer from hookworm, they suffer from tuberculosis. And most of them go from cradle to grave without ever seeing a doctor. That's the immediate background for African Americans going into the 20th century. What I discovered also was that there were a few opportunities and a few examples of pushback by people who wanted to improve the status of African Americans, their stations in life. One thinks immediately of the NAACP, of the Urban League, of Black leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois, and of efforts in health, such as National Negro Health Week by Booker T. Washington, to try to begin to address Black health problems. The immediate background for Tuskegee comes out of this push to try to improve the status of African Americans, the situation. At this point, I'd like to show just a couple of slides of the people who are really subjects in the Tuskegee study. The photographs I'm about to show are taken from Charles Johnson's classic work, Shadow of the Plantation. As it happens, they were taken in Macon County in 1932. And while I can't prove it, I would not be surprised if some of these photographs aren't photographs of the homes and the subjects in the Tuskegee study itself. What I'm showing you or about to show you are just snapshots of rural poverty. This is the sharecropper's home. The cotton going right up to the edge of the shotgun shacks. This is one of the old men sitting on his porch. Again, a portrait of rural poverty. This man sitting by his fence. This man standing next to his mule. It's hard to tell who's more emaciated, the mule or the man. Certainly both are undernourished. Certainly both are, in a bad place. All right. The houses and the photographs I've just shown you were for a purpose. These are the kinds of people who will become the subjects of the Tuskegee study. How does the Tuskegee study begin? It starts with an effort to do good. The Rockefeller Foundation, its medical division in the teens and 20s, became a pioneer in public health in the rural South. They battled pellagra, they battled hookworm, and they inspired others to want to do good. One of the groups inspired was the staff at the Julius Rosenwald Fund. And they wanted to create schools in the South, which was their, primary mission. But they also, so am I on the screen now as well as the picture? Or just the picture? Just a second. Anyway, the Rosenwald Fund wanted to do good. They built schools, but they also tried to do some public health matters. Screen?
No, you're just going to show the picture.
Okay, I want to get back on the screen. Just me.
You're not going to show me more pictures.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm going to continue to show pictures. This gentleman, Tolliver Clark, became involved really as a consultant. The Rosenwald Fund wanted to do something in public health. Its medical director, Michael M. Davis, didn't know anything about Blacks in the South. So he contacted the Public Health Service and asked them for an advisor. The person who was seconded was this gentleman, Tolliver Clark. And it happened that he was the director of the medical division of the Public Health Services Division of Venereal Diseases. In that position, he believed to his fingertips that syphilis was the most important disease confronting Blacks in the South. And so he suggested that the Rosenwald Fund put money into the treatment of syphilis in African Americans. With Rosenwald Fund money, the Public Health Service, under Clark's direction, went into 6 different southern states, each of them chosen because it presented a different epidemiological profile of African Americans and a demographic profile. And they went in and with a Wasserman dragnet, and they tested the population for what was called bad blood. And bad blood was a catch-all term in the Black community, which meant syphilis, pellagra, anything that was wrong with you, they called bad blood. They figured, well, my blood's bad and I've got this disease. So the importance of those demonstrations was that they wanted to show that syphilis could be treated in Blacks. The medical literature of the day said that Blacks were too stupid and too involved with their own libidos to be suitable subjects for treatment. Doctors in the public health service wanted to combat this idea. And so they created mobile clinics that got Blacks to accept treatment. They got very good results. And they showed that if you use the techniques of modern epidemiology, you could treat African Americans with syphilis just as surely as you could whites. They wrote up articles about their great success, and it was supposed to spur more programs funded by the states. All this happened in 1929 and 1930. And that was when the stock market collapsed. And so there was basically not much money left. But the Public Health Service asked the Rosenwald Fund to fund a program of untreated syphilis. They wanted to go back to Macon County, Alabama, and study syphilis there. And the reason they wanted to study it there was that it had the highest incidence of syphilis of any of the communities that they'd studied. At the low end was Albemarle County in Virginia, which was like 6%. At the high end was Tuskegee, which was like 35%. So if you wanted to study untreated syphilis, Macon County was a ready-made laboratory. The Rosenwald Fund said that it couldn't fund this because of the Great Depression. Their stock was tied to their finances and they didn't have the money. So Clark decided to just fund it himself. And he decided on Macon County because that's where he found the most syphilis in the controlled demonstrations. He sent 2 public health service officers, just a second. Oops, go the other way. Okay, not working. I went the wrong way, sorry. This man, O.C. Winger, and this man, Raymond Bondelier. He sent them to Tuskegee to set up a study of untreated syphilis. In order to do that, these 2 gentlemen met with the leadership of the Tuskegee Institute, with Eugene Dibble, who was the head of the Andrew Hospital, and Robert Russa Moten, who succeeded Booker T. Washington as principal with the Institute. They told them both that they wanted to study untreated syphilis because it would be very important to science. They wanted to show that it was basically a different disease or reacted differently in Blacks and in whites, and they needed a study to prove this. The theory was that in Black people, syphilis was more likely to attack the cardiovascular system, and in white people was more likely to, to attack the neural system. They assured them that the results of studying untreated syphilis would be put to good use in therapy and that everyone would benefit. So based upon these assurances, the Tuskegee Institute agreed to cooperate with the study and lend its good name to support it. That was critical because it means that the Public Health Service was able to trade upon the trust and the goodwill that African Americans had toward the Tuskegee Institute. So the next part of setting up the study was to convince people in Tuskegee to cooperate with it. They did this by lying to them. From the beginning of the study, it was based upon a bald-faced lie. The lie was that they were there to treat them for syphilis, not simply to study untreated syphilis, that they would give them medicines to cure them from the disease. When that lie was told, people believed it. And they believed it because they told them it was a continuation of the Rosenwald Fund diagnostic and treatment program. So they used it basically to just slide back in keep going with the goodwill that they'd earned with the earlier treatment program. The person who was a linchpin in helping this happen is this woman, Eunice Rivers, Nurse Rivers. She was an African-American nurse trained at the Tuskegee Institute who had worked for the state of Alabama for almost a decade in public health, and whom they recommended to the Public Health Service to be the person to work with them in the Rosenwald Fund syphilis control demonstrations, but also in this Tuskegee study of non-treated syphilis. Her job basically was to reassure the men that the study was going to help them, to answer their questions, to transport them from their homes to the Andrew Hospital, to the clinic to be examined, and basically to serve as the liaison, the buffer and the bridge between the African-American subjects in the experiment and the doctors who conducted the experiment. The other part of setting up the experiment that was crucial was to get the cooperation of local doctors, white doctors and Black doctors in and around Tuskegee. The Public Health Service did this by convening meetings of the public health, of the medical societies of the local physicians. In those meetings, they told them exactly what they were going to do, that they were going to study untreated syphilis, that they were not going to treat it. Moreover, they asked the doctors not to treat any patients from the study who might inadvertently show up in their office for treatment, to deny them treatment so they would remain untreated. All right, this took whatever small chance those men had of being treated and simply took it away from them. Most of them were going to go from cradle to grave without seeing a doctor anyway, but whatever small chance they had of securing treatment was negated. It was denied them by the deal that the Public Health Service struck with these local doctors. Now, why did the local doctors agree to cooperate? They did so because they were told it was an important scientific study and it would benefit medicine, benefit scientific medicine. Okay, with all that in place, there was only one more thing to do, and that was in 1932. All this is happening in early 32, in late 1932, they decide to add a control group to the study. And they decide to add a control group to the study because an important thing happens during that first year. In the first year, no one thought the experiment would last 40 years. Everyone thought it would go on for 6 months, 9 months, 1 year max. But instead, what happened was that those two doctors whose photographs I showed you, Dr. Raymond von der Leer and Dr. Oscar Clarence Winger, they became so gung-ho with the examinations, they were mesmerized by the pathologies that they were discovering in the untreated patients. And their argument back to their boss, Tolliver Clark, was that, my goodness, if we can learn a lot in 6 months, how much could we learn if the study were open-ended? So they lobbied very, very hard for the study to go forward. Oscar Winger and Tolliver Clark and Raymond von der Leer all butted heads over this. And in the end, Tolliver Clark told them, no, I don't have the money. You have to, end the study in, about 10 months. So they tried to wind things up and they came back to Washington. But then a funny thing happened. Tolliver Clark retired. And guess who replaced him as the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the U.S. Public Health Service? Raymond von der Leer. And the moment he took the helm, the future of the Tuskegee study was secure because he had no intention of ending it. He had every intention of continuing it as long as possible. So when he came on board, the Tuskegee study suddenly has an open-ended future, a long lease on life. That's when, second, let me get him for you just a second. This gentleman, John R. Heller, Rod Heller, is sent to Tuskegee to put together the control group. The control group are 200 men who don't have syphilis to match the 426 men who are syphilitic in the study. They want to compare the lifespans and the health of a group with syphilis with a group without syphilis. This gentleman puts together the control group. And once it's in place, all the ingredients is there. Excuse me, I'm going to go back now because I want to show you some more stuff later. John Heller is that person. All right. After 1932, everything's in place for the study to go forward. And how it works is a model of simplicity. Once a year, public health service officers from Washington, D.C., and from Atlanta, Georgia, and from different offices are sent to Tuskegee to conduct what they call a, quote, annual roundup. The annual roundups are that they pick the men up at different gathering places, they take them to the Andrew Hospital, they perform various examinations on them, they in effect see how the disease is progressing. Think of Tuskegee County, or Tuskegee and Macon County, and some of the men live in Tallapoosa County and Bullock County and Russell counties, the contiguous counties. Think of it as one huge sick farm that is overseen by absentee owners in the public health service who come back once a year to look at the diseased subjects who are their, sort of annual roundup stock. That's the way they consider them. So that happens year after year after year. The only other time they see the men is if individuals become sick. When they are ill, Nurse Rivers picks them up, takes them back to the Andrews Hospital. And the object is for them to die in the hospital so that autopsies can be performed, so that the clinical observations and data that has been compiled can be supplemented with autopsy findings. So that's the MO. That's the way it's going to work. And it's going to work for 40 years. And the reason it's able to go on for 40 years is that no one objects to it. Everything is handled within the public health service and within those local medical societies of local doctors who would agree to it. The other thing that assures it's going to go forward is the practice of the public health service of promoting from within. I just mentioned that Raymond Bondelier succeeded Tolliver Clark as the head of the division. The guy I also showed you, John R. Heller, who put the control group together. In 1943, he will succeed Raymond Bondelier as the director of the division. And so it goes decade after decade after decade. Promotion from within assures that the staff conducting this experiment has continuity. It's people who at one point of their careers or another either worked on the experiment or were very familiar with its progress. Guys would go to the file drawer. They would open up the drawers and they'd see these published articles that I'll show you. And they'd say, oh yeah, I remember that. I went down to Tuskegee in 1938 or 1941 or 1956 as a young public health service officer. And I examined these men and I helped write some of these articles. And I know the study. It's good science. It's good medicine. Okay, my argument is that all these guys are co-opted by familiarity. They don't have an opportunity to see the study through new eyes. They're hostage of the views that they formed over the years because they worked on the study or knew about the study. So because the study has no natural enemies, no one who's going to say, no, this is morally wrong. We shouldn't lie to these men. We shouldn't deny them treatment. We shouldn't tell them that we're treating them and deny them treatment. The whole moral bankruptcy, that no one's going to raise these questions because they're all in on the deal. All right. I'd like to think, though, that there were opportunities in which they could have reassessed that very, very sad progress I've described. One of them would have come in 1937, because in 1937, a new Surgeon General of the United States was appointed. His name was Thomas Perrin. And Thomas Perrin had it in his head that syphilis was one of the most important diseases, if not the most important disease confronting the United States. He wrote a book, Shadow Over the Land, which was a clarion call for the public to go to battle with syphilis and eradicate it. So under his auspices, the Public Health Service geared up and started really trying to do something about syphilis in states that had not been very proactive. They did this by following the Rosenwald Fund demonstration model. They put together mobile teams, they put them in mobile clinics, they sent them into the hinterland, they used a Wasserman dragnet to test as many people as they could. After they tested people, they treated with rapid therapy using arspetamine, neo-arspetamine, mercury by induction, treatments of the day. They treated the men with a rapid schedule and they produced cured results. They killed the spirochetes. All right, in 1938, one of those mobile clinics hit Macon County. And sure enough, men in the experiment would have been treated at the government's expense, except for the fact that Nurse Rivers accompanied those mobile clinics with a list of men and controls who were in the experiment. And she said, don't treat that man or don't treat that man because he's in the study. All right. That was the first time that the men were in any real danger of being treated. Ignorance, the fact that they didn't know about their disease, poverty, the fact that they couldn't afford to pay for treatment, those two things had conspired up to this point to prevent them from being treated. But as of 1938, they are actively denied treatment that would have been forthcoming. And that to me begins to change and ratchet up the moral bankruptcy of the study. The next opportunity they had to rethink the study was World War II. Because in World War II, the draft was enacted, and about a third of the men in the Tuskegee study were still young enough to be inducted into the armed services. Had they been inducted into the armed services, they would have, as part of their physical before that happened, been diagnosed with having syphilis, they would have been given rapid treatment, and they would have been rendered, in the parlance of the day, rendered fit to fight. They would have been cured. The men in the Tuskegee study don't get that opportunity. The Public Health Service sends list of the participants in the study, the subjects, to each of the local drafts boards in Macon County, Tallapoosa County, Russell County, Bullock County, and says, do not draft these men, please. They are already serving the country. They are soldiers of science, and we don't want them treated. They're in an important government study that will bear important results that will help our soldiers in World War II. So that's the second time they're turned down. The third time was 1943. The state of Alabama passed something called the Henderson Act, and it was a model public health act requiring treatment at state expense of all communicable diseases. The Henderson Act was never applied to the men in the study because the state health officer and the local health officers working for the state, the county officers, all agreed to cooperate with the study. That's another time active treatment was denied. The next opportunity, I think, was penicillin. Penicillin was developed in World War II. It was a wonder drug. The treatment until penicillin was laborious, tedious. It lasted about a year and a half. It took a good clinician to know how to adjust the dosage. Basically, it was poison. It was arsenic, arspetamine, neo-arspetamine, and mercury rubs by induction. But it worked, and the men were denied it. So John Heller, whose photograph I showed you earlier, was in charge of the division from 1943 forward. I interviewed Dr. Heller, and I asked him if they ever considered giving the men penicillin. And he said, certainly not. And I said, well, at the risk of belaboring the obvious, why not? And his answer was because it would have entered the study, and the study was important. When I thought about it after that interview, his answer didn't surprise me. The doctors who began the study in 1932 withheld arspetamine and neo-arspetamine and mercury. They upheld the treatments of choice, the treatments that were available, the treatments that were efficacious in 1932. So in the 1940s, when an improved treatment came along, I don't think it presented any moral quandary. I think public health service officers had already crossed that Rubicon. They had decided to withhold treatment, and the fact that a new treatment became available did not give them any second thoughts. The next opportunity, when I think they could have stood back and thought about the experiment, comes directly out of World War II's Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code that was adopted as a result of those trials. When the world learned to its horror what the Nazi doctors had done with human experiments on prisoners and patients, mentally infirm, Jews, gypsies, anyone under their control. When the civilized world learned about those experiments, they were appalled. And the Nazis who were responsible, some of them were hanged for their atrocities. And the Nuremberg Code was supposed to outlaw among civilized nations that sort of thing and prevent it from ever happening again. I asked Dr. Heller whether he and the other doctors ever discussed the Tuskegee study in the light of the Nuremberg Code. And his simple answer was no, we didn't think it applied. All right, another opportunity missed. The final one, I think, comes in the 1950s. Macon County, Tuskegee, is about 26 miles from Montgomery, Alabama. And in the mid-50s, Montgomery, Alabama became the epicenter of the civil rights movement, the beginning of the civil rights movement, which would become the largest people's uprising since the American Revolution. Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. Martin Luther King organized the Montgomery bus boycott. They were both represented by a young attorney named Fred Gray, about whom I'll say a great deal more later. He was a young African-American attorney who was the NAACP staff attorney in Montgomery. Rosa Parks' protest, the Montgomery bus boycott, was the trumpet blast that announced the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. Americans were confronted from then going forward with demonstration after demonstration, with unrelenting pressure from African Americans taking to the streets, demanding their rights under the Constitution. One would think that with this heightened spotlight, this exposure of Black protest and the push for Black rights, one would have thought that the public health service officers conducting the experiment might start to get a little uncomfortable under the collar about what they were doing. And the answer is they did. They understood suddenly that what they were doing might not be well received if it were known publicly. But instead of internalizing that ethic of wrongdoing, they simply continued to tell themselves that it was good science, good medicine, that they could go forward. Now, what they did do, I found examples in their correspondence, in their memos, in which they would decide, for example, not to publish an article once in a while, or to delay something because they thought the time not be propitious. So they were aware that they might have a public relations problem, but they didn't frame it as a moral issue. By the way, on the screen here is an example of one of the articles published. Let me go back a second. Excuse me, I'm not very skilled at this. I want to go back here. Okay, yeah, these are just a series of articles. And the only reason I want to show them is to just stress the point, emphasize the point, that at no point of the study is it surreptitious. It's never sub rosa, it's never hidden in the medical community. There are, over the 40-year period of its lifespan, no fewer than 14 published articles in major medical journals. They don't make any attempt to obscure what happened. They all say as a preamble, this is a study of untreated syphilis in a group of Black African American or Negro Americans in rural Alabama. So inside the Club of Medicine, everyone knows what's going on, and I want to stress that. The other thing I want to stress just before we get into more modern times, is a couple of pictures. That's ulcerated cutaneous syphilis. I think it wouldn't hurt to know what we're talking about in terms of what the men are suffering. That's a spinal tap that they're doing to see if the spirochetes are in the spinal fluid. These are just routine chest examinations, EKGs, eye examinations, etc. This is Nurse Rivers in the field giving what the men think is medication. I said it when I started talking about how they set up the study that they made them think they were being treated. They did this by giving them two things. They gave them an iron tonic. They would say, take this tonic and you'll feel healthy as a mule. And they gave them aspirin. The aspirin was, to relieve their aches and pains. And for many of them, it was a miracle drug because they couldn't afford it. They didn't have it and they thought they were getting good treatment. So this ruse of treatment is how the deception is perpetuated. This is a venipuncture. They take a blood test every year at the annual roundups. This is just a guy, being underground, being tested. I'm showing these photographs. Notice that there are two African Americans in them, along with the white doctors. This is Jerome Peters. He's a black pathologist. This is Eunice Rivers, the black nurse. I'm doing this to show the element of biracial support. Black Americans, African American doctors are involved in the Tuskegee study from the beginning. The facilities of the Andrew Hospital at Tuskegee Institute are used to conduct the experiment. The element of biracial support is very strong from the beginning, and it's a subject that is worth, more and serious discussion. All right. In the 1950s, I've said that the civil rights movement might have given the Public Health Service pause. It did not. The experiment kept going. Just a second. We'll get up here. Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't show this. After 25 years, each of the men were given a certificate with their name filled in gratitude for their 25 years of participation. Okay. The experiment, I think, would have kept going had it not been for a man named Peter Buxton. Peter Buxton worked at the Hunt Street Clinic. Just a second, let me do something about my throat. Peter Buxton worked at the Hunt Street Clinic in San Francisco, San Francisco, California, as a and really as a factotum. He was epidemiological follow-up worker. He was supposed to go out and interview people and then get them tested if they'd been exposed to syphilis. In the mid-1960s, when he had just gone to work for the Public Health Service, he overheard two co-workers at lunch talking about the Tuskegee study. And they were talking about it in the kind of a matter of fact manner, and he just couldn't believe what he was hearing. So he started to research it. Part of his job was he had to do some kind of paper every 2 months, and he decided to make Tuskegee his research project. Well, he started reading all those articles I just flipped through and learned that the Tuskegee study had been going on, since 1932, and this was in 1965 when he learned this, and that nobody was trying to hide it, and that it was exactly what they said it was. It was people being denied treatment, being lied to, and having the disease studied. So this really upset him. And he complained to his boss, and his boss told him to shut up. So he wrote a letter to a guy named Brown, William J. Brown, who was the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases, and his offices were in Atlanta, Georgia. And he wrote a strong letter of protest. Well, Brown didn't respond to the letter, but he asked one of his colleagues who was going to be in San Francisco to talk with Peter Buxton. The colleague did and came back and told Brown that Buxton, was just incorrigible, that he was still very upset about the study. So Brown decided to invite Peter Buxton to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and to, have a meeting with him about the study. So they flew him out there. Peter Buxton goes into this big conference room with a lot of, fancy flags. I later was in the same room when I was helping Fred Gray depose people at the Center for Disease Control. And to cut a long story short, he enters into an ambush. I mean, the room is filled with doctors who have worked on the Tuskegee study and who just really beat up on him and tell him that he's not a doctor, he doesn't understand medicine, he ought to keep his mouth shut because he's sticking his nose into things he doesn't understand, and really, he's just being a troublemaker. So he takes all this and kind of goes home and licks his wounds, and a few months later, he decides to resign from the Public Health Service. He goes to law school at Hastings in San Francisco. He tries to enter some of his law professors in the study. They blow him off. One of his professors is Prosner, who is really one of the lights of torts. And Professor Prosner tells him, "Rough young man, stirring up litigation. Why, the statute of limitations is long since run out, so there's nothing you can do." But Buxton can't get it out of his head. So a few years later, he's having dinner with a girlfriend whose name is Edie Lederer. And she's a reporter for the Associated Press, and I think she's the head of their Far Eastern desk, and she's back in San Francisco for some R&R. And so they have a date, and Buxton, who of course is he's like Diogenes. I mean, he's trying to find the honest man. And he's telling one of three his story. So he tells the story to Lederer. Well, this time he's finally told it to the right person because she can't believe what they're hearing. So they get a Chinese dinner, and they go to his apartment, and they sit on the floor, and he starts feeding her these articles, and they eat Chinese food. And she's saying, "Holy shit, I can't believe this." I mean, so she decides immediately that she wants to go to work on Tuskegee and expose it. And she tells this to her bosses. But her bosses say, "Nah, you got to go back to, the Far East where you're stationed." So her boss gives the story to a woman named Jean Heller. And Jean Heller was the person I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. I said who wrote the 4 hard-hitting stories. Heller goes to work on it. She calls people at the CDC. She reads the articles. She asks questions. They answer questions. It's all no big deal. They ask like they have nothing to hide. So she writes her articles. And when she writes her articles, wow, everything is bad. Everyone condemns it. So everyone wants to know how this could have gone on and how the Public Health Service, could have kept it going on. After those articles, the Public Health Service comes under a lot of pressure, and they all try to pass the buck. No one seems to know how it started or who was responsible. There's a lot of crawfishing going on, with people just trying to deflect blame or responsibility. But a lawsuit filed, oops, am I going right? No, I'm sorry. A lawsuit filed by this gentleman, Fred Gray, begins the process of trying to get justice for the men. Fred Gray, I mentioned earlier, was the attorney who represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King back in the mid-50s in Alabama, in Montgomery. His law practice had a small office when he was at the NAACP, and then he opens his own office in Tuskegee. Well, Fred is one of the most distinguished Black attorneys of the civil rights movement. He's a giant. He's argued a number of cases before the Supreme Court. He's a skilled, brilliant jurist, and he's a bulldog. I'd rather have a bear after me than Fred Gray, because a bear might get tired and decide to eat somebody else. But Fred Gray, if he takes you to court, is gonna stay there until a verdict is rendered. Fred brings a class action suit on behalf of the subjects of the experiment and the estates of those who were deceased. And he secures an out-of-court settlement. That's not as much money as I think everyone would have wished, but at least, get some justice. As part of, or while this litigation is going forward, Ed Kennedy holds hearings in the Senate on human experimentation. And Tuskegee is the centerpiece of those hearings. And Peter Buxton, this gentleman, who was the whistleblower, testifies and lays out the story. The docs who conducted the experiment tell their stories. Subjects in the experiment, including this gentleman, Charlie Pollard, who's the spokesperson for the men in the study, all tell their stories. And, people can sort out whether it was a fair fight. The men were lied to. They were denied treatment. Many of them died. More than 100 of them died as a result of not being treated. And the men tell their story that we thought they were helping us. We thought we were being treated. It was awful. So the response of Congress is to pass the Human Subjects Act. And the Human Subjects Act is designed to prevent future Tuskegees by mandating informed consent. It's the one policy payoff that really comes out of this horrible, horrible story. What else comes out of it is that institutions across the country are required to have IRBs, institutional review boards. Any hospital or university or stuff that gets federal money to do any kind of human studies has to have an institutional review board that is to examine protocols and keep something from Tuskegee, like Tuskegee, from ever happening. So that's where the Tuskegee study at one point, could have an ending, but it doesn't end there. The good things that happen with the Human Subjects Act, the effort to try to learn and benefit and make corrections and establish better rules, all that comes out of Tuskegee is to the well and good. But what else comes out of Tuskegee is horrible damage to the African American community's trust in the medical world. When African Americans looked at Tuskegee and heard about it and learned about it in the press after the story was disclosed, they didn't look at it in 1972 from a current events point of view. The lens that they brought to bear was much broader, went back hundreds of years. They put it in a frame of reference that included the history of race relations that began with capture in Africa hundreds of years ago, the horrors of the Middle Passage of being transported across to the New World, the slave blocks where they were auctioned into chattel property, the horrors of slavery up to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the betrayed promises, the 40 acres and a mule that never happened, the peonage system, the cropland system, the sharecropper system that made them little better than subsistence survivors on wages with no mobility. They looked at Jim Crow, they looked at the loss of vote, and that's the frame of reference in which they put Tuskegee. It was just another example of white people inflicting horrible harm on Black people. It was the medical equivalent of lynching. Consequently, when a new and mysterious disease broke out in 1981, HIV, many people, educated people in the African American community feared that it was a man-made disease created in laboratories for the express purpose of inflicting genocide on African Americans. When people would try to reason with them, saying, no, that's not true. That's not what caused or how HIV came about. How can you believe that? The answer that they gave almost invariably was Tuskegee. If the government doctors did this to us, how are we to believe that they are not responsible for HIV and trying to do something more harmful to us again? So that residue of mistrust, ill will, ran like a mineral trace throughout and course through the veins of the African American community. Once trust is shattered, it's very hard to rebuild. as the author of Bad Blood, I became a member of what was called the Tuskegee Memorial Committee. And our purpose was to, excuse me, pressure the White House to issue a formal apology for the Tuskegee study. And in 1997, April of 1997, President Clinton issued that apology. That's me mugging it up in the East Wing of the White House when Clinton apologized. That apology was, I think, very well received among African Americans. They appreciated the acknowledgement that they had been grievously wronged, and they were grateful to President Clinton for that apology. So I think the Tuskegee study story could have ended there. But once again, a new disease, a mysterious disease, and a catastrophic disease, COVID, plunged our country back into another discussion of the effects of Tuskegee on African American trust in the medical community. When COVID-19 when it just burst out on our country, everyone scrambled for an explanation of what caused it, what its effects would be, who was responsible for it, and then the process of trying to get a hold of the disease, how to test for it, how to develop a vaccine, how to get people to mask, how to get people to social distance, all the tools that could be used to try to deal with this horrible pandemic, once again created new discussion of Tuskegee in newspapers, among talking heads in the medical community. Once again, African Americans expressed their suspicions, their mistrust, their distrust in the medical establishment because of what Tuskegee had done. And once again, people in medicine had to address the fears and concerns and the ongoing angst and just pain that African Americans felt because of the betrayal and the damage that Tuskegee created. So when people ask me now, what about Tuskegee? I say it's the tragedy that continues to resonate, that continues to have echoes, and continues to exacerbate efforts to have the African American community enjoy good health. My one thought going forward is that if anything could help alleviate those concerns, it would be to pass national health insurance, to have poor people get access to health care that they can afford and that would be efficacious, and that no longer to have people who are for sale cheap because they can't afford care. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, very, very much. For some reason, I don't think you guys can see me, and I'm not exactly certain how I get back. But this is Dr. Golowski. I am here, and I'm not sure that you need to see me. Dr. Jones, just remain unmuted because we have several questions here for you.
Okay.
It's truly excellent talk.
I'm sorry for my froggy voice.
Okay.
I knew this morning when I got up with laryngitis, it was going to be a tough sled, but.
Okay. Well, we had a question, a very early question,
Okay.
about COVID and about COVID-19 and the trust of African Americans in the medical profession and healthcare. I think you have kind of answered that within the context of Tuskegee. You can go on further about that if you would like, but we had a question from a nursing student early on who was wondering, how far do you think public and community health have come in the decades since Tuskegee?
We have made significant progress. the significant and uneven progress. The thing about poverty, and especially rural poverty, because it tends to be more hidden, is that we have different generations of Americans that rediscover it. Congressmen and senators will go out into the hinterland and stuff, and they will find people who are malnourished, and they'll see people living in squalor, and they will be shocked, that this is still a problem. But I think if you deal with aggregate populations, I think there's no gainsaying that public health in the United States has improved, that our diet has improved. But insofar as these things being eradicated is concerned, of course they haven't been. As long as we have people who are malnourished, who live in squalor, who don't have access to health care, we're still going to have an unequal health profile of Americans. Some people, our country is such a paradox. It has arguably the most sophisticated, wonderful medical science and state-of-the-art care anywhere. And where things get complicated and things become tragic is that access to that care is so uneven. And we continue to have substantial and morally indefensible segments of our population, larger than pockets, that do not benefit, do not share in the wonderful bounty and the just brilliant successes of healthcare that more affluent Americans, more educated Americans, can afford and routinely enjoy.
Dr. Jones, I think I could almost answer this question, but I'm not, having read the book, but I'm not going to. It's a real quick factual question. It just popped up in the chat. Did you uncover anything with regards to the school administration and leadership? This would be of Tuskegee. Were they complicit, or was this all done without their knowledge?
No, they're complicit. The experiment, I discussed this in the book. When they're putting together the study, all the people in Tuskegee or in the Public Health Service realize that one of the keys to making this work is that they've got to get the Tuskegee Institute on board. They've got to be able to use the medical facilities. One of the things that commends Alabama or Macon County, Alabama, as the site of the study, two things really. One is the high incidence of syphilis that they uncover there, so they know there'll be plenty of subjects. And the second is the Tuskegee Institute's facility that they can use as a home base. They can use the Andrew Hospital for their examinations, and they can use the Tuskegee Institute's imprimatur, if you will, their prestige, the trust, the bond of trust that African Americans have with the Institute. So when Tolliver Clark and Raymond Vandelier and O.C. Winger, the troika of doctors who really put this thing together, at the beginning, they know they have to meet with Eugene Dibble, who's the head of the Andrew Hospital. They have to meet with Robert Roux-Simone, and they have to win those guys over. And they do. And from the beginning, the support of the Tuskegee Institute goes forward and they're a junior partner, I would describe them that way. With Tuskegee, there are big responsibilities and lesser responsibilities, but there are many levels of responsibility. And clearly, the most important burden of responsibility rests on the shoulders of the Public Health Service. Mm-hmm. But after that, the Tuskegee Institute is very complicit.
One of the early questions in the chat asked why the study focused on men and not on women, and were there any comparable studies of white men?
Okay. First question, why men and not women? Syphilis is much easier to diagnose in men than it is in women because of the shape of female genitalia and because of the shape of male genitalia. With men, you tend to get a chancre, a cancerous sore, on the penis, and it's right there. You can see it. But due to female genitals, those chancres can be more internal and they're not spotted as early. The disease can progress much further along before the diagnosis is made. And so with the study, they wanted through clinical histories to have, date lines. When did you get this? When did you see that sore on your penis? And so with men, they could give them much more concrete answers. And with women, it was more difficult. Were there other comparable studies? And the answer is yes. There was a study, the Oslo study, that was done in Scandinavia by Buxton. And it was done to study the spontaneous evolution of syphilis in white people. The difference, and it's a very important difference, is that this study, the Oslo study, began before the first treatment for syphilis was ever developed. That was arspetamine, neo-arspetamine, or actually it was called Salirsin, when Paul Ehrlich discovered it in 1906. And that was the first specific treatment for a germ-caused disease. And so the medical world went crazy about it. They thought, wow, finally we can kill a germ. They had the germ theory of disease, but they had no tools to kill those germs. So in Scandinavia, in the Oslo study, when Salirsin was developed, they immediately gave it to the men. They stopped it. They stopped the study then, and they made it a retrospective study, okay? But they treated. Now, when they wanted to do Tuskegee, they were very aware of the Oslo study. And it really brings up a kind of a crucial point in racial medicine. Many white doctors convinced themselves that because blacks were black, diseases affected them differently. Race was an incredibly powerful prism for them. And since there'd been a study of syphilis in white people, the public health service officers thought there ought to be, there really should be, there had to be a study in black people to create a black counterpoint to the white study to document the differences. Now, what differences did they expect to find? Well, in white people, the medical idea of the day was that in tertiary syphilis, in the third stage of syphilis, it was much more likely to attack the brain, the neural system. But in black people, it was much more likely to attack the cardiovascular system. One of my chapters, a perfect gold mine of cardiovascular syphilis, trades upon that point. What they were saying was the crudest reductionism you can imagine. At base, what they were saying was that white people had bigger brains, and therefore simple reduction, a bigger target. Black people, muscular, field hands, work all day, in the fields. They have to have a stronger body. They have to have a bigger body and bigger muscles and a bigger cardiovascular system. The first guy to write about this was a Virginia physician named Taylor, I think, in 1874. It's the first time I saw this in the literature about black people, heart, white people, heads. But then if you trace it from the 1870s on, it becomes an article of faith, and you see it in articles and you see it in textbooks. So Oslo had documented white people. Tuskegee was supposed to document black people. But the other thing was that medical doctors in the 19 teens and 20s, deeply racist in their views, argued that syphilis was so endemic in the African American community that not only was it a fundamentally different disease, but that for many African Americans, because it was so ubiquitous, it had lost its venereal quality, it was endemic, and it wasn't that severe. People had been seasoned by the disease, and maybe they could just live with it. So there was a rationale for not treating a disease, which by their own estimate, they thought was epidemic, okay? Public health service officers knew better than that. They knew from several very prominent urban clinics, one at Johns Hopkins, one at Penn, one at different, leading medical schools, where African-American patients would come in for treatment. They knew from those patients that they examined, because they'd seen patients at different stages of the infection, that syphilis was a killer, was an absolute killer in blacks, just like it was in whites. There was no difference. And so one of the ironies of the Tuskegee study was that Clark really wanted to document how serious syphilis was in Black people, to take that information back to state health departments and local doctors and say, you can't blow it off. You can't say it's not serious. It's killing these people. We've got to treat them. So I thought one of the ironies of Tuskegee is that, you know, in the name of withholding treatment, they want to create more treatment. That's one of the silly ironies that happens when you try to understand something in all its complexity. And when I said, that these guys don't have blood dripping from their fangs, I hope what I've demonstrated in this is that compared to most physicians of their day, the doctors in the Tuskegee study, I think, could be considered by the standards of their day racial liberals, because they wanted to do something about Black health. They wanted to benefit in some way African-American communities. And the fact that they were able to withhold treatment and lie to the men and stuff simply shows what a huge moral blind spot they had that compounded all this swirling stuff that they're trying to do and made it really, really nasty when, yeah, they had some good intentions, but all this is wrapped up in such profound racism.
Dr. Jones, some of the questions I'm seeing here are a little bit repetitive in terms of asking comparisons with whites. I want to move on to a few that maybe are a little bit more distinctive. And just following up on what you were saying about the untreated patients, would they ever complain and perhaps attempt to withdraw from the experiment?
I have no instance of a patient becoming aware that the treatment that they were getting was not helping them. They don't withdraw from the study because they think they're being helped. I mean, one of the saddest tragedies is that the men going forward, I interviewed them. I interviewed a number of them, and I certainly spent a lot of time with their attorney, Fred Gray, when I was working with him on the case. Being his gopher and trying to help with get the case for trial. One of the things the men told me and their kids told me was that they thought they were in kind of a privileged group. That Nurse Rivers' Lodge, some of them called it, that they were getting stuff that nobody else in the county got, and so they thought that they were being benefited, that they were being helped, and so I've found no instance of a person diagnosing correctly what was wrong with them and seeking care. They thought they were being cared for. Now, I have found, since the book was published, a few instances of local doctors who did not honor the agreement not to treat the men. There was one doctor in particular who was in one of the documentaries that was made on Tuskegee, who one of the guys comes in, he finds out he has syphilis. His nurse tells him, we can't treat him. He's in the Tuskegee study. And the guy says, nonsense, treat him, treat him. So, but no, I think most of the men, almost without exception, never get treated. Now, when they do get treated is after the study. Part of the settlement, once the Public Health Service is exposed, the pressure on them to treat the men is overwhelming. They had argued earlier that they shouldn't treat the men because of a rare reaction called the Herxheimer reaction, that some of the men might react to penicillin. Well, that was nonsense. It's very rare. So when Gene Heller breaks the story and Ted Kennedy holds his hearings and the papers have lots of articles and stuff on Tuskegee, all the men get treated. All the men are given penicillin, and they get something that most Americans don't have. They get lifelong medical care at the government's expense as part of the settlement, part of the atonement that the Public Health Service gets. It's ironic at the end, they get the health care, which if they had had at the beginning, they never would have cooperated.
You mentioned Nurse Rivers. She's such a compelling figure, a major character in the study. And we have a question about her. Did Eunice Rivers and other African-American nurses and doctors in the study know they were giving fake treatments to the patients?
Yes, Nurse Rivers knew that.
And did she receive any incentive to hide the truth? I mean, what I get in the book is that, you know, she was this sort of up and coming aspiring professional who was, you know, a lot of her identity, I think, was being a nurse.
So how are we on time? I don't want to.
I think we can go for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes. You know, some of the questions are a little repetitive. So,
okay. Well, Nurse Rivers, I think, certainly deserves a good chunk of that time.
yeah.
She's the only person to whom I devote an entire chapter of the book. The doctors, I string them along as they become part of the story. And I do that because I see them as kind of wood-dimensional, you know, cut from the same cloth. They're clinicians who want to be scientists, and they think they have an important study, and they don't question themselves. And, you know, that mindset, they're Shakespearean. They're true to character to the end. The only person in that book who I think has texture and complexity is Eunice Rivers. The first thing I think to know about Eunice Rivers is that she's the daughter of a sharecropper. Her mother dies when she's fairly young. Her father raises them. He's an excellent father. He works 2 jobs. He works as a sharecropper. He works in a sawmill. He really just does everything he can to create opportunities for his daughters. And he sends her, you know, to as much public school as he can. Then he sends her to live with an aunt in Georgia that has more, you know, better public schools. Then she comes back to Tuskegee. She's the oldest, so she's what my grandmother would call the bell cow. She's supposed to lead the way, you know, for her sisters. Be the pathfinder. So she goes to Tuskegee, and at Tuskegee, she starts off in some kind of arts and crafts program, basket weaving or some such thing. And then her dad beats on her and says, "No, you're going to have a profession." So she switches to nursing, and she becomes the most outstanding nurse of her generation in their nursing training program. So much so that Eugene Dibble, her mentor, when his wife is ill and almost dies of acute appendicitis, the nurse that he selects from the nurses group to help him with her to be his wife's nurse is Nurse Rivers. So after graduation, she gets a job and works for almost a decade for the state of Alabama. And she's one of the first African Americans hired by the state. She's a pioneer in desegregating public health in the state of Alabama. She works as part of a rural team. There's an agricultural worker and a home ec worker. And they go into the, you know, rural hinterland, and they do these demonstrations. And her job is to teach elementary obstetrics and gynecology to the local midwives, and to teach them how to fill out a birth certificate, and teach just fundamental public health measures to people who live in poverty. You know, you got to have a toilet, you got to have running water, you got to, she teaches that gospel. And then her job goes away because when the stock market collapses, the Alabama State Department, can't afford her, and they let her go. So Eugene Dibble throws her a lifeline. He creates a job for her at Tuskegee as director of night nursing at the Andrew Hospital. He gives her a night nurse's job. And that's where she is when the Public Health Service comes in there and wants somebody to go to work on the Rosenwald Fund demonstrations. So they want a Black nurse to work with them when they go out to treat people and find them how much syphilis there is. He recommends her. She does a bang-up job. My God, she's just a force of nature. The men love her. She's, bigger than life. And then when they come back and want to study syphilis, Dibble again recommends her. He said, well, you're going to need this nurse, and you can't be better than Nurse Rivers. Well, at that point, she comes to him, and she, when I interview her, she shares this with me. She says, I had some misgivings about this study. And my misgivings primarily, frankly, she says, I'm a clinician. My job is to help people get well. And I'm not a scientist, and they were saying this is going to be important to science, but I want to do something that was important for people. He said, well, then she said, Dibble told me that the science that they're going to do is going to help people. And you're going to have a multiplier effect. So he gives her what I call in my head the Jackie Robinson speech. I mean, he tells her to suit up. You're the best we've got. And yeah, you may have to take some abuse and stuff from this, but now you have a chance to help desegregate the United States Public Health Service. You're our best nurse. Whatever they ask you to do, you can do. So he gives her that Jackie Robinson speech and boys, so she takes off running. Now, if you've read the chapter, and I know you have, she becomes aware pretty early on that some of the doctors are just pretty nasty to the patients. They treat them like field hands and they order them around, and she's not comfortable in having their men, with that kind of verbal abuse. And so she stands up for them. She takes the doctors off the knees. You treat these guys like men. You don't have to talk down to them. So all of this, is her being, I think doing good. But at the same time, she knows that they're not being treated. All she knows is that it's supposed to be okay that they're not being treated. I think the way she negotiates or navigates that horrible moral ambiguity is that Tuskegee doesn't take all of her time. It's just the annual roundups, and she has to go, get people in for autopsies and that kind of stuff, negotiate with the family for permission for autopsies. But the rest of the time, her salary is paid for her to do bona fide public health work. So I asked her, I said, well, when you weren't working on Tuskegee, what were you doing? And she said, I was minding my mamas, my old folks, and my babies. And I know from talking with the men that many families have many kindnesses to thank her for.
Yeah.
She would beg clothes, she would beg food, she would try to help the needy. And I think in Nurse Rivers' head, I'm not a shrink, but it doesn't stretch my credulity to believe this. I think in her head, those two worlds of hers, roles of hers, melded. Mm-hmm. And she became the nurse who she thought helped everyone. And what I didn't put in the book, and I'll share with you now, is that when we were driving, I spent several days with her, and a couple of times as we were driving around, and I just asked her, I said, I don't want to judge you, I just drive around, and I want you to go down memory lane. And every time we'd go to a new place in the hinterland, we'd come out of a pine thicket, and there'd be a shotgun shack, and she'd start telling me a story, So every once in a while she'd say, well, maybe we did do some things wrong. And I said, oh, I don't want to hear that news. I want you to just tell me, how it happened and share with me. So after I finished the interview in her home, and I turned off the tape recorder, I said, Nurse Rivers, except then she was Nurse Lowry because she had married. She married late in life. I said, Nurse Lowry. But for most of her career, she was Nurse Rivers. I said, Nurse Rivers, a couple of times you've told me that maybe you thought you guys did some things wrong. And each of those times I was unspeakably rude and I interrupted you and I said I didn't want to hear. I said, I just wanted you to tell me stories about what happened. I said, I'd be grateful now if you'd share with me what you thought was wrong. And I'll never forget her face. Her eyes teared up, her lip quivered. And she said, oh, Dr. Jones, we should have told those men they had syphilis. And God knows we should have treated them. Well, I interviewed a number of the doctors in the study. Not one of those individuals expressed any moral contrition whatsoever. She's the only one who I think internalized the ethic of wrongdoing, that she got it, that she understood at the end that so much of her life was in the service of evil and that she would have to live with that. One of the days I was with her, and it made a big impression on me, we were at the town square in Tuskegee, walking to a cafe to have lunch together because we were taking a break from driving around. And a black couple on the same sidewalk as us started walking toward us, and a half a block away from us, they spotted her and they crossed the street. They would not walk by her. And she just held her head up as high as she could and she kept going. But the ostracism there was clear. And I thought, okay, this is her life. whatever punishment she's going to have for what she did, she's living. And I find the fact that she found the character and the moral courage to say to me what she said, and those were our parting words. I have found that, if not redeeming, at least altogether human and altogether the words of a person with heart.
Jim, there are a couple of questions here that I can kind of tether together. Somebody asked if the people who perpetrated the experiment were ever brought to trial. And again, I think the answer to that is no. And then somebody asked, just your personal opinion, do you think universal health care for Black people could be a form of reparations?
Well, let me take the first question first. One of my bitter disappointments about the Tuskegee study is that no one responsible for it suffered consequences. No one lost a medical license. No one went to trial. No one had to defend acts that resulted in other people dying. Now, if that's not, voluntary manslaughter, but I'm not a lawyer. But I look at those facts and I think, okay, people have a very critical illness. You tell them you're helping them. You tell them you're treating them, and then still you'd lie to them. And on numerous occasions, you block them from getting treatment, and some of them die from their disease. Now, I don't know how to frame that in terms of murder one, murder two, manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. There are a lot of tools in the legal box, that you could pick up and see which ones apply. But I very much wish that had been sorted out in a court of law, because there should have been accountability. There should have been an opportunity to have a jury decide the facts and have those facts presented to the jury. The only, and this is not even a slap on the hand. The only consequence of which I'm aware, one of the doctors, and he was, I think, one of the most, it's hard to defend him, Sid Olansky. When I was on Good Morning America, the producer called me after my book came out and said, we want to have you on. And I said, I'll come on. But he said, what would be your dream show? I said, my dream show would be to have some of the men from the experiment on, have some of the doctors from the experiment on. I'd like to be there, but I also insist that Fred Gray be there because I want the men protected. I said, but let both sides tell their story, and then let's see, if people think it was a fair fight. And so that's what they did. They gave us like 9 minutes, and that for that show was a big segment. But I don't know who scheduled it, but they picked us up at the hotel we stayed in a limousine that morning, like at 4 o'clock in the morning. We had to be there bright and early. And for some reason, Sid Olansky was in the same car with Fred Gray and Charlie Pollard and Herman Shaw, men and subjects in the experiment. And so, we're driving to the studio, and he leans over and pats Herman Shaw on the leg and says, well, Herman, it doesn't look like we hurt you too much, buddy. And Mr. Shaw, who was a man of great dignity, just stood up straight as a rail. He said, don't touch me. And I leaned over and said to Sid Olansky, wasn't because you didn't try. So Sid Olansky, when he left the Division of Venereal Diseases as a senior public health service officer, was a professor at Emory University of dermatology. And I think his sons went into practice with him. He also had a private practice. And the rare book room in the Emory Medical Library, I think, was named because of a donation they gave for the Olansky. So I think for Sid Olansky. Well, after the Tuskegee study was exposed and the public learned what had happened, African-American students at Emory were outraged and demanded that plaque come off the Rare Books Library. And unless I'm mistaken, that happened. And so that would have been, as I say, if that did happen, and if I'm correct in the story, I haven't been back there to check it. That would have been a slap on the hand, but nothing more.
Dr. Jones, this is just one last, it's not a question, it's a comment from a former history professor, and I think we'll just sort of leave it here. If you want to add anything, the comment reads, race was clearly a factor in this study. Tuskegee Institute helped to make the study credible, even though it was so deadly to Black men. Black men in the study got a free meal on the day of exams, $100 for burial and exams. It's sad. And, you know, when you mentioned Nurse Rivers, some of the most compelling parts of the book are how she was able to get families, you know, and I think she had some sort of incredible record of getting families to agree to autopsies.
Correct, she did.
And this, you know, when you lose somebody who's so close to you and you go through all of the bereavement and the fact that she was able, you know, that she had become so much part of their lives.
Well, they trusted her. They trusted her. And, you know, what she also had that greatly enhanced her ability to secure these permissions was that the Milbank Memorial Fund provided funding to the public health service to give a burial stipend for funeral expenses to the men. Well, many of these families were hard pressed to, to afford that kind of help with burying their dead. So the fact that they could get an undertaker and get maybe a tombstone and a coffin was, I think, a huge incentive for them to, agree to cooperate with, giving permission for the autopsies.
Dr. Jones, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. It's a fascinating story, very tragic story, obviously, very important story. Many thank yous coming through the chat. Because of the technical issues, I actually can't see my picture. So I hope that people will see the cover of the book, Bad Blood. And hopefully you can see that and read that book as well. I'm doing a little bit of a plug here for Alfred C. Kinsey as well. This is, again, a fascinating story, again, in the area of medicine and health and public policy and American society, and how all of these things, really do intersect. I'll allow you to have the last word, and then we will say goodbye to our guests. And thank you once again.
Well, thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my story with your students. I would also like to say on a personal level, Dean, I've enjoyed our correspondence and getting to know you as we're not that far apart. When I'm back in DC, maybe sometime we can fish together. I'd like that.
I'm not much of a fisherman, but you can teach me.
Okay.
You have taught me an immense amount about this very, very important and very tragic chapter in American history, and African American history. And I hope people will buy the book, and I hope that they will read it. And I hope we can have you come back for a kind of seminar in person, since, as you said, you are only 2 hours and a big bridge ride away.
Yeah, well, that would be fun. My friends and colleagues who are still teaching all can't wait to get back in the classroom. We miss students, we miss that interaction. So let's hope this horrible pandemic calms down and we can all get back to the business of our love of history.
Very good note to end on. Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you for everyone who participated this evening.
Okay, have a good evening. Stay well.